Welcome to the second week of Bloomborough. Every Monday, I like to start the week off by doing a best of one, best of three meta review. And so today we'll be covering the top 8 decks according to Untapped, which is a third-party tracker, and also going over the best of 3 tournament winners in the Standard Challenge, which is a tournament on Magic the Gathering Online, and has a lot of really top-level competitors, and is a really great way to keep track of what's going on in best of 3. So as I go through the weeks of this process, we're going to bump into some of the decks that I've already talked about, and I don't really want to repeat myself and go through every single card like I did in last week's video. So when we come into an archetype that I've already covered, like Selesnya Rabbits, for example, I'll give you a brief rundown of it, but we're not going to go as in-depth. So the top performing #1 deck from Bronze to Mythic, according to Untapped, was Selesnya Rabbits. And if we compare it to last week, there were no changes to the list. It is kind of replacing the mono-white humans kind of vibe, where you're flooding the board and then you have a bunch of bunny synergies. So Beauregard Minter getting power equal to its toughness, being able to give all of your rabbits +1/+1. You've got the Hop to It, which allows you to kind of like the Gleeful Demolition in Boros Convoke before rotation. I guess it's actually still around, but this allows you to enable a Knight Errant of Eos and refill your hand, which then makes it resistant to wraths like Temporary Lockdown and Sunfall. So this is a naturally good option to go up against Mono Black Discard as well, because Mono Black Discard is trading 1-for-1 with your resources, where this is producing more than 1 rectangle per card, and quickly gets out of hand for a deck that's trading 1-for-1. So its natural weakness is to the mono red prowess builds. You usually are able to get enough damage in because there's no interaction in this. There's no turn 1 or turn 2 way to prevent the Slickshot Show-Off just killing them on turn 3, right? So that's kind of what I mean by the rock, paper, scissors of the meta. I'll do my best to point that out where I can. And on to the next one. So Mono Red Aggro has moved up to #2, and is a very similar list to the one that I covered last week. The only change being that they dropped 4 mountains and went for 4 rock face villages. I do agree with the 22 land count. Although the curve looks relatively low, you do have cards that you can play for a higher amount. And I haven't found like flooding out in this deck happens all that much, especially with the Emberheart Challenger being able to give you dig. So this one's kind of the similar to the Rakdos Prowess. It has less of a consistent turn 3 win than the Rakdos Prowess deck has, but is more resistant to your opponent having an answer for the Slickshot Show-Off. So it's kind of a give and take between those two decks. The general theme or general strategy of this deck is plot the Slickshot Show-Off, and then on turn 3, play 3 combat tricks like Monstrous Rage, Might of the Meek, and you can already have the Demonic Ruckus plotted. You can do direct damage with the Shock and the Lightning Strikes. These specifically, too, give you that interaction that Rakdos Prowess kind of leans more towards the combat tricks to get a more consistent turn 3. These allow you to have interaction against the other Prowess decks and makes you better in that matchup. Oh, before I just really quickly, the weakness to this deck is the black. So Go for the Throat and Cut Down are both really good black instant speed interaction, which can remove the opponent's threats. Sorry, mono red prowess's threats. So weak to single point interaction. And then third place is Rakdos Aggro, and it's very similar to the list that I showcased back in week 0. That was the Mythic list that Magic Christian, used to climb to Mythic #1 in 4.5 hours. Really, the only difference is dropping the 3 Sulphurous Springs for 3 additional mountains. And last week there was the Fugitive Codebreaker was at 2 and the Emberheart Challenger was at 3. So going back to a 3-1 split this week. And this is very similar to the Mono Red Prowess strategy, except for you have a more consistent turn 3 off of your Slickshot Show-Off because of 2 combat tricks like Felonious Rage or Dreadmaw's Ire gets this to power 9. and then after dealing 9 damage, you then sacrifice it with the Callous Sellsword with Burn Together, and fling it, and it gets the +2/+0 before it gets flung, and deals 11. So you can really do it, really easy to do a 20 damage combo on turn 3. Again, like the mono red prowess builds, it's weak to single point interaction, especially instant spell. It has to be instant speed to kill it on the turn that you're playing the Slickshot Show Off, and doesn't go as well into the later part of the curve as mono red aggro does. All right, number 4 is we're going to see a split in domain into 2 different archetypes, because the difference between running the Cornucopia and the Heaped Harvest is actually enough to change the matchups between what you're seeing, how the matchups do against other archetypes. So this one is going to be called Witch Domain, or 4-color domain. So Witch being the color of Atraxa, everything but red. And so this one is going to be, we'll talk about Witch Domain separately than 5-color domain, but it is very similar. So if we compare it to the one that I covered last week, which was the 5-color domain, we can see that it's dropped the Lightning Helix, which is really the only red card that's being run consistently, and dropped the 4 copies of the Ancient Cornucopia, and instead is running the 4 copies of the Heaped Harvest. We see this quite commonly in the best of 3 scene, and I think that I'm not surprised to see Witch Domain doing better than the 5-color space. We also increased 1 Jace the Perfected Mind, and brought in the additional Get Lost and a Temporary Lockdown. So it makes it a little bit easier to play that double pip white, to not be stretching the mana so far to include the red for the Lightning Helix. And the Jace is really included for the matchup against other domain decks. A lot of times they go to mill, and they're a very grindy matchup because you kind of just take turns. Somebody plays a Herd Migration, somebody plays a Sunfall in response, somebody plays a Herd Migration, somebody plays a Sunfall in response. But as far as the meta goes, the domain deck is weaker against that mono, it's weaker against the mono red builds because of only leaning on the Get Lost to have an answer for the Slickshot Show Off, but because of the Temporary Lockdown and the Sunfall is a really great answer to the Celestia Rabbits. Number 5, according to the tracker, is Rakdos Lizards. And I got a little ahead of myself last week, right before the tracker updated everything. The meta was still really chaotic in week 1. Since then, just even hours after I published the video, I left a comment about how the rankings had changed, and so Rakdos Lizards was included in that little comment that I left on the video. So I don't think I actually covered it last week. But if we compare it to what we were seeing at the last week, we do see a couple of changes in the list. So we've dropped the 4 copies of the Valley Rotcaller, which is the 1/3 for 1 and a black that hits your opponent for the amount of lizards that you have. We dropped the 1 copy of Ran Executioner Thane, which I think was just being explored, and the 1 copy of the Hellspur Posse Boss. So a Hellspur Posse Boss giving all of your outlaws haste. A lot of the lizard space is made up of outlaws. And instead we're bringing the Fireglass Mentor up to 4. This card is absolutely amazing, gives you amazing dig with how readily this deck is able to deal damage to your opponent without even attacking. Gives you really great fuel. And we're bringing in a 3rd copy of the Laughing Jasper Flint, which also gives us additional resources that we can play from our opponent's deck because of all of our creatures being the outlaw creature type. As far as the spells go, we dropped the Sheoldred's Edict and brought in an additional copy of Cut Down and an additional copy of Go for the Throat. Pumping those both up to 4 helps against the mono red prowess matchup. And then bringing in the 3 copies of the Scales of Shale. And this one helps if you're trading blows with your opponent back and forth. Being able to get that lifelink can be the determining factor, especially in the mirror match. This one's a new archetype, so I'm not as certain about its matchups and what the counter is. I haven't gotten to play it myself. As the meta gets a little bit further down the line, I'll be a little bit better able to answer what is the immediate counter to the Rakdos Lizards deck. And as far as we also saw a shift to the lands. So we've dropped 1 Cavern of Souls and the 4 Fabled Passage. So notably, this list is not running the 4 Fabled Passage, which combines rather nicely with the Vine Lasher because of being able to trigger landfall twice. If you have the Outlaw or the Offspring, then your Fabled Passage alone is dealing 4 damage to your opponent. So keep that in mind that this list is dropping that, and that seems to have been a better performing direction than the list the previous week. Also dropping the 3 Rakdos Manlands, the Restless Vince, and instead just leaning on the basics of an additional mountain, 2 swamps, and more of the villages cards that we got from Bloomburrow. So running 3 Rockface Village to be able to give our lizards haste, because a lot of the lizards, I think all of the lizards are missing haste. And then 1 additional copy of the Mudflat Village to be able to bring back our lizards from the graveyard. So it's not that the Fabled Passage is bad with the Vine Lasher. It just was not needed for this deck because you're already dealing enough little ping damages with the general strategy. And you don't need the haste from the Hellspur Posse Boss because instead we're leaning off of the Rockface Villages. Now, another just quick little asterisk. These decks are definitely not finished. This is not the final form of Rakdos Lizards, and part of the reason why I do this every week is just to give you ideas and tell you what has been performing well for the most amount of people. Okay, number 6 was 5-color Domain, and this is the one that is running the Cornucopias, and compared to week 1, there is no change to this list. The general strategy is wipe the board with Temporary Lockdown and Sunfall, and then eventually play an Atraxa that your opponent just can't answer the amount of resources and life that this card gives you. And then the main win con is the Herd Migration. Oh, and then also to mention, the Up the Beanstalk helps against the mono-black discard decks, which are something you need to address in the control and mid-range space. All right, number 7 was mono-black Skeletons, and as we start to see as the meta matures a little bit, right? So like week 0, we see this really top-performing Rakdos Prowess deck that establishes turn 3 is kind of the new pace, right? In response, Mono Black starts running a bunch of instant speed interaction for the Slickshot show-off, so like cut down and go for the throat. Then you have a response from like Mono Red being like, okay, well, let's do what Rakdos Prowess is doing, but instead maybe lean a little bit further away from the turn 3 and still go for like a turn 4 or turn 5 win. And so similarly, you're going to see like an extension of some of the decks. Like if you compare this one to last week's list, you see a lot more mid-range threats starting to come in. And similarly, you see an evolution of Mono Black Discard. The one that I covered last week was more of a mid-range deck rather than just a purely hand-hate deck, right? And so like if we start to see more of a swing towards control instead of aggro in the meta, then you're going to see a reversal of that process. And so right now, since control is not super popular right now on the ladder outside of Domain, mid-range has room to breathe, and so you can kind of extend your curve a little bit. So this one, we dropped the 3 copies of Gisa the Hellraiser. The one downside is this card is prone to Sunfalls, so the fact that like Domain is the one control deck, Gisa then is a little bit weak or prone to getting destroyed by the Sunfall. We brought in the 2 copies of the Vadmir, and that's another one that kind of extends the longer the game's going, because you can do these several crimes throughout the turns and then make this into a large menace lifelink threat. So typically we see Vadmir Newblood go away once the mid-range decks stop doing quite as well and are favoring more of an aggro build like I covered in week 1. But Gix Yawgmoth Praetor really works well for the decks that are not able to block your early interaction. So Forsaken Miner being in this recurring threat, a lot of times your opponent doesn't want to trade with this card because you can just bring it back every time that you're committing a crime. And so it actually works pretty well for Gix. This one's not running Deep Cavern Bat, which is one of my favorite cards to put with the Gix Yawgmoth Praetor because of the evasive flying on your 2-drop. That being said, though, I still think it fits relatively well into the archetype, and we're bringing in 2 copies of Sheoldred the Apocalypse. This one, again, is better against the mono-red builds than the Rakdos Prowess builds, because you're stabilizing on turn 4. Rakdos Prowess aims to win on turn 3. Mono red, on the other hand, might have a harder time getting through the 4/5 body and the Death Touch, as well as the life stabilization that this card is going to give you. Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal is a nice recurring threat outside of Sunfall, right? So if you're coming up against like the Mirror, where you've got only black removal like Go for the Throat, then Aclazot's just keeps coming back. A little bit weaker though against the exile effects like Sunfall. And Cut Down we usually see either at 4 or 3. Again, it can be a dead card in your hand. Depends on the matchups. So this one deciding to drop 1 Cut Down, which is not super uncommon. Tiny Bones joins up, going down from 4 to 2. And this one was really in the deck just to trigger Gisa. And so since we're dropping the total number of Gisa, it kind of makes sense to drop the Tiny Bones joins up. We're also dropping 2 copies of the Case of the Stashed Skeleton. Again, this one has better and worse matchups. Really depends on how well your opponent is able to play the Menace. So as we see the performance of Selesnya Rabbits increase, I think we're going to see more and more of a go wide strategy coming into the meta. And especially if you were following yesterday, I talked about my meta breakers, and a tournament destroyer and mythic climbing deck that you're going to bump into is Boros Tokens, which is using the Carrot Cake and the Caretaker's Talent in white. So as more of these go wide strategies, then the Menace doesn't work as well. And we've got the Hopeless Nightmare to give us a little bit of hand hate, which I think also reflects a little bit more of the mid-range and the control, because this card is less good against the aggro decks. And as far as the lands go, we dropped 3 Swamps to bring in 2 copies of the Volatile Fault. And this one is just non-basic land hate, and I guess it goes on a little bit further than that because it does create the treasure token. But what's cool about this sort of thing, and why you see this sometimes in the Mono Black Skeletons builds, or the Mono Black Crime space, as it was kind of referred to in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, is because of being able to trigger a crime, right? So the Sandstone Verge is another way that we can trigger a crime. But if we're up against a creatureless deck like Azorius Control, then the Volatile Fault is that way that we kind of get the recurring crime trigger, which Vadmir and Gisa care about. We're also running 1 copy of the Hidden Necropolis, which is a way to discover 4, and kind of gives you like a card draw, but is expensive. All right, and the 8th one on the list, according to the tracker, is Mono Black Aggro. And again, I did include this one in the video last week, except for it was in the comments section, so I didn't really actually get to talk about it. So Jeskai Convoke and Boros Convoke are kind of taking a back seat this week. The Selesnya Rabbit's kind of doing a similar strategy, and with the there being less of a benefit to doing it, they turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos, because you get better payoffs by being able to include some of the large green threats like the Valley Might Caller and things like that. I'm not surprised to see the Convoke space kind of taking a step back. It was another one also that we kind of speculated on, because they decided not to ban the Knight Errant of Eos during rotation, which was kind of a sign that they were going to either nerf Boros Convoke or bring in an archetype that was going to do what Boros Convoke was doing, but in a different way, right? And so that's what we're seeing. And this one, there's no changes to the list that I posted in week 1. This one has actually been around for a while. It doesn't have any Bloomburrow cards. You start off on turn 1 with a Death Toucher or a Flyer. You're going to utilize the Deep Cavern Bat to draw off of Gix. So this one's leaning more heavily into the Gix synergies and the early evasion. Caustic Bronco's pretty aggressive card. We've got the Cut Down and the Go for the Throats for the Mono Red Prowess builds. We've got Shieldred's Edict for a little bit of Planeswalker hate. Liliana also helps with the control matchups, being able to attack their hand. Preacher of the Schism being a really great mid-range, kind of stops Mono Red aggro. Lord Skitter Sewer King gives us kind of this graveyard hate while also going wide. And Shieldred the Apocalypse, then drawing... Every time that we draw a card, we gain 2 life, which combines with Gix really well, because instead of losing life when we draw off of Gix, we're actually gaining 1 life. We'll lose 1 life and then gaining 2. And so that's a really nice synergy. Gix's Command helps with the go-wide strategies, not actually seeing like a Glistening Deluge or Choking Miasm or something like that, which we might start to see more of in the following weeks, depending on how popular the Selesnya Rabbits build becomes. Acklezot's Deepest Betrayal, again, is really great threat as long as you're not up against Sunfall. And then Virtue of Persistence, giving you that early interaction and then kind of a late game win condition. All right, so now that we've kind of established the top 8 and it feels a little bit more solid, we'll see how it goes throughout the weeks. Best of 3, though, is still really kind of trying to figure out what's going to become like the main deck to beat in Best of 3. And so starting off with last weekend, we have Azorius Convoke by Hamuda, which took down first place and is a new archetype. To an extent, we've seen Azorius tokens or Azorius Convoke in the past. And so you've got the classic culprits like Novice Inspector being able to create 2 rectangles, giving you that clue token, and then the body. You can tap it with the Warden of the Inner Sky. Case of the Filched Falcon gives you the clue token as well as the enchantment. Spyglass Siren gives you the map token as well as the body. So you're able to kind of flood the board really well. Mockingbird can enter as a copy of anything, so it kind of can play like another Novice Inspector in this deck, or further up the curve as well. Destroy Evil is a pretty good tech card against Boros Convoke, and that was the I think a lot of people anticipated there to be a lot of Boros Convoke post-rotation because it didn't really lose that many tools, and what we're actually seeing is a lot more Domain. And so this one works against Domain. You can shoot the Up the Beanstalk. It works really well against Boros Convoke because you can shoot the Case of the Gateway Express or the War Leader's Call, as well as destroy the Knight Errant of Eos. It was a really great tech card against Esper Midrange, against Rafine, but that one's kind of rotated out. But anyway, that's the white tech card there. Regal Bunnycorn, being able to get a power equal to the number of non-land permanents you control, is what this deck is all about. Springload Sawblades being removal that then also leaves a permanent behind that then helps make your Regal Bunnycorn bigger, that you can also animate. The Subterranean Schooner works pretty well with the flyers off of like Spyglass Siren, being able to explore and push in for additional damage. Also helps you with the card draw and ensuring your land drops. Zoetic Glyph can animate any of the tokens that I was talking about off of the Case, the Novice Inspector, the Spyglass Siren. And then we have Steel Seraph as a way to kind of give us that lifelink if we need it, or be able to give us flying if we need to push the damage through, or vigilance if we're in a more defensive spot. A lot of times I think lifelink is usually the choice when I've played this deck in the past. And I've played a version of it that was very similar, except for it didn't have Mockingbird, right? But we've also got the Manlands, the Restless Anchorage, and then just like Azorius Fixing. And this one I'm going a little bit more in depth with because it is a new archetype. So the Best of 3 sideboard, we've got the Get Losts, which give us that enchantment hate with the downside of giving our opponent map tokens. We've got the Disdainful Stroke, which works really well against all the Domain that we're seeing. Basically, if they're running like Atraxa and Sunfall, this is really good. You can use it too in against Boros Convoke to silence or to counter the Knight Errant of Eos. But since we're seeing that less often, not sure if that's going to be like the tech card of choice over maybe just running a negate. So we'll see if we see more of a favor for the negates over the Disdainful Strokes as time goes on. Tishana's Tidebinder is one that has a lot of different targets that it's pretty good against. Anything that has that like ETB triggered ability, it's particularly good against Planeswalkers. So I think the most common Planeswalker is probably Jace in Azorius Control, or Liliana in Golgari Midrange. But especially if they're running Planeswalkers, I think Tishana's Tidebinder makes a pretty good one to bring in. We've got more enchantment hate with Destroy Evils that we can sideboard in. 2 negates. If you're running up against a control list, you're going to bring in the negates. Lauren of the Third Path even further extends the artifact and enchantment hate, and we did see Azorius artifacts take down a first place last weekend. So this kind of giving you that artifact, not just enchantment hate, right? Because this is just enchantments, this is just enchantments. So this is good if you're coming up against like the Urabrask's Forge and Mono Red, etc. And then Werefox Bodyguard is pretty good at, so if they're running like single point interaction, you can use this to exile your own thing, right? So it's not just removal for your opponent's stuff, It works pretty well if they're running tokens as well. But one of the things that you can do that some people miss is that you can target your own thing and then sacrifice the Werefox Bodyguard to bringing that thing that you guarded back, right? So like if you have a really beefed up Warden of the Inner Sky that you don't want to have die, like the Werefox Bodyguard can save it. I guess this one would probably be saving the Steel Seraph because you do lose the counters when it like goes out of play and comes back. But yeah. One of the things that too is that if you do the prototype with the Steel Seraph and then get rid of it with the Werefox Bodyguard and then sacrifice the Werefox Bodyguard, this will come back as its full-sided 5/4 instead of a 3/3. So there's some interesting synergies with the Werefox Bodyguard. All right, number 10 here. Okay, second place was Domain by Sandeutsch. Took down second place. And we haven't talked about what Domain is doing in Bloomburrow yet, I don't think. It didn't make it into the top 3 during the first week of the standard challenges, but we're seeing 3 top 3 finishes this week. So Domain is definitely coming in strong. So kind of like I mentioned already in Best of 1, exploring the Heaped Harvest instead of the Ancient Cornucopia. That seems like a change that's going to be here to stay because it ramps you twice and gives you the 3 life gain. So it gives you a little bit less life gain maybe over the course of a really long game than the Ancient Cornucopia. But the ramping twice part of it is amazing since we lost the Topiary Stomper. And but we've got like the Up the Beanstalk and the Sunfalls and the Temporary Lockdowns, and it's very similar to the list that we were seeing in Best of 1. Nissa Ascended Animist here being an option that we can kind of see come and go throughout the weeks, depending on how well you need that artifact or enchantment hate, or how well you need an overrun effect to get through your opponent's defenses. So this deck, it was surprising, I think, everybody that it works perfectly fine without the Triomes. A lot of people speculated that this archetype was going to be kind of toast after losing the three land types, but it works pretty well with the dual lands. As far as the sideboard goes, we've got Elspeth's Spite, which I think is this deck's probably best option for mono red, since we did lose the knockout blows. Bringing in an additional 2 copies of Get Lost if we're up against usually early aggression. The map tokens matter more in the mid-range and control matchups. Aggro tends to not use the map tokens as well. Negates, full playset of negates, all 4. So if we're coming up against another Domain deck, if you're coming up against Azorius Control. 3 Obstinate Baloth is a really great option if you're coming up against Golgari midrange and Liliana. It's a way to punish them from making you discard. We've got a 4th copy of Temporary Lockdown that we can bring in if we're coming up against Boros Convoke. Haven't actually seen Celestia Rabbits really yet, so curious to see if that makes it into the Best of 3 tournament scene. Definitely going to see more of that Boros tokens build, though, I think, coming down the line. 3 which we'll cover here shortly. 3 copies of Tranquil Frillback, and this one I think is really your best bet against the mono red, like against the aggression with that 4 life gain. But also giving you artifact and enchantment hate. And then Archangel of Wrath, also you can bring in the 4th copy if you're up against an aggressive archetype. All right, and 3rd place was taken down by Golgari Midrange by Kassa. And this one was in the top 3 last week. So we have some comparisons that we can talk about. And so if we compare this one to the one that I covered last week, we can see that this is leaning more towards the Vraska Betrayal's Sting and the Innkeeper's Talent. So Innkeeper's Talent, once leveled up to level 3, if you would put a counter on something, you put twice as many. That includes loyalty counters for Planeswalkers. So if you have this at level 3, you can play Vraska Betrayal's Sting with 12 loyalty, immediately ultimate, and then give them 9 poison counters that gets doubled into 18, and you just win the game. So this is the Vraska OTK deck, seeing, taking down 3rd place here. So we're gonna ditch a lot of the mid-range threats, a lot of the creature threats. So we got rid of 2 Glissa Sunslayers. We got rid of the Kervik the Punisher, which was being able to bring back your black interaction, and we dropped the 4 copies of Preacher of Schism, which is a really nice mid-range threat. We dropped the 2 copies of the Hostile Investigator, which helps against attacking their hand if we're coming up against like control. And we dropped 2 copies of Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, because we don't need. We're just trying to get to our OT, our 1-turn kill, and instead we brought in the Deep Cavern Bat to remove, or, make our opponent stumble, get rid of some of their interaction, get rid of their key parts, make them spin interaction on a 2-drop that doesn't really matter. A 3rd copy of Liliana the Veil. Again, we can make them discard their hand while we're stalling to hit into our 1-turn kill, as well as making them sacrifice creatures. And we've got the 4 copies of the Vraska Betrayal's Sting, and lowering the overall interaction of cut down to 2, and taking out the Gix's command and instead bringing in the Duress. So the one way that the 1-turn kill gets interrupted is if they have removal for the Innkeeper's Talent after you've sunk all that mana into it, or they have a counterspell for your Vraska coming down. And so Duress, kind of hold on to your Duress until you're trying to clear and make sure that your opponent doesn't have any way to stop the 1-turn kill, would be my suggestion. And then, yeah, 4 copies of the Innkeeper's Talent. And as far as the lands go, we've got the 2 copies of the Fabled Passage and a Swamp, and instead of the Underground Mortuary. So curious to see if this is the new version that's here to stay, or if we'll see kind of a back and forth, and this should be considered its own new archetype. As far as the best of 3 sideboard, we see a large rework as well. So we've lost 2 Duress in the sideboard, brought into the main. No Scrap Shooters, which were the 4/4 reach for 3. That you can gift your opponent thing to destroy an artifact or an enchantment. Harvester of Misery is also cut from this. Again, that one I think was a tech for Boros Convoke. And same, we're dropping the Glistening Deluge and the Malicious Eclipse, and instead running the 4 copies of the Choking Miasma, which is the sweeper of choice for this one. And this deck is not running as many creatures, so the +1/+1 on our creatures, like, I don't know, it's a one to explore over the Glistening Deluge, is trying to do kind of one-sided board, a one-sided board wipe. And we're dropping the Phyrexian Arena and bringing in 2 Terra Sunders, giving us that artifact and enchantment hate, and the Tranquil Frillbacks, bringing those in for the stabilization against mono red, as well as the artifact and enchantment hate, because there's less of a need to attack our opponent's graveyard. There are a couple of decks here and there that are exploring doing that, but nothing that's really become mainstream. And we've got the 2 Gix's command from the main in the sideboard, so you're going to bring this in against the go wide strategies. And we've also run an additional Nissa Ascended Animist in the sideboard that you can bring in if your OTK is getting disrupted and you want to just focus on actually pushing damage through with your creatures. I think this one, Control might be able to lock this down a little bit better than some matchups, where the Nissa, because it doesn't get affected by the Sunfalls and whatnot, I think would largely be for that matchup. All right, and first place, so there's 2 standard challenges on Saturday. The second one, the first place was taken down by Abzan Midrange, and this is similar to the Golgari midrange, but bringing in white for the Zoraline, Cosmos, and Archangel Elspeth, and Beza, the Bounding Spring, which this is a pretty good mid-range value card, and gives you that life stabilization and can flood the board and can give you card draw, and largely filling in some of the gaps that were left behind by Wandering Emperor. But seeing both the Archangel Elspeth and the Beza kind of surprised me because of them both being double pips, so they seem like somewhat difficult splash. Like the Zoraline makes a lot more sense to me, but we still have disruption through the cut downs and the go for the throats, the Deep Cavern Bat, Analyze the Pollen being able to tutor, as well as smooth your land drops, and we've got Season of the Burrow as well, which can bring back Zoraline, which is a particularly powerful combo. So really interesting mix between Golgari midrange and Orzhov midrange in this list. Hardest part being all of the double pips in this, whether or not the Fabled Passage is enough to actually carry that through. But it got first place, so maybe that's the 3-color space. Let's bring it on, right? So The sideboard, we've got Duress for against the control matchups. We've got Tear Asunder for Artifact and Enchantment Hate. Same with Lauren of the Third Path. Temporary Lockdown for the Go Wide strategies. Tranquil Frillback for life stabilization against aggro. Long Goodbye, which is particularly good if they have something like Ward, where you don't have to pay the ward because it can't be countered. Pest Control, also like good for the Go Wide strategies, eliminating the tokens. Would be bringing in the temporary lockdowns and the pest controls, potentially. We've got a third copy of the Beza, the Bounding Spring, for stabilization against the aggro decks. Hostile Investigator against control. And then Akelzot's Deepest Betrayal if they lack exile. Second place was also taken down by Golgari Midrange by Una Giel, but was the exact same list and sideboard as Kassa, so we won't be covering that one again. The third place was taken down by Azorius Control by Giga Chad Sigma Male. If we compare this one to last week, we see a couple of changes, nothing too crazy. So we see that they decided to bring in a second copy of the Tishana's Tidebinder, good against the Planeswalkers, also decent against the Boros Convoke matchup, which we, eventually I'll have to stop talking about Boros Convoke, but it was a very popular deck prior to rotation. The Get Lost. So taking out one Get Lost and taking out one Quick Study. And taking out a Darkar Waste to run a Demolition Field and a Plains. So upping the overall land count and leaning a little bit more towards the Tidebinder. And the best of three sideboard was also almost the exact same. Tishana's Tidebinder being replaced by a additional copy of Jace the Perfected Mind. All right, and here's the third version of Domain this week. This was first place on Sunday by OVML Cabrera, and it's doing something different. And I like it because what they're doing is they're doing something that makes the matchup better against the other Domain decks. So, Deadly Cover-Up, if you are able to collect Evidence 6, you can then remove that card from your opponent's graveyard, right? So it can be any card as long as it's in the graveyard. This is a really great way to get rid of all of your opponent's herd migrations instead of answering it with the Sunfalls, right? And or a great way to get rid of the Atraxa later in the game. So you can take away your opponent's win conditions and then they're just spinning their wheels, right? So I thought that was a really clever addition to be a little bit more towards the black that we don't usually see. So we see a really large rework of this deck. So we've got the Archangel of Wrath got dropped down 2 copies. Jace the Perfected Mind got dropped down 1 copy. Nissa the Ascended Animist got dropped. 2 Sunfalls got dropped to make room for the Deadly Cover-Ups. And we brought in 2 copies of Negate in the main. 2 copies of the Urgent Necropsy, which again, leaning onto the evidence in your graveyard to be able to destroy multiple targets. Domain typically having an enchantment and a creature and a planeswalker to target, so pretty good tech there against a domain heavy meta, which I think we're starting to see. And then we also, like I mentioned, the Deadly Cover-Up giving him a pretty good edge in the mirror match. Dropping Cavern of Souls, Hedge Mage, and Lush Portico, as well as 2 Meticulous Archives to bring in a Forest and Island and 2 Shadowy Backstreets to give us that more access to black. We're also bringing in a Swamp and the Underground Mortuary. As far as the sideboard goes, we also see a very broad sideboard. It's not particularly focused. So we're dropping the 1 copy of Elspeth Smite, the Get Lost, the 3 Negates, and the 2 Tranquil Frillbacks, and 1 of the Obstinate Ballets to bring in a Disdainful Stroke, and again, another good tool to have against other Domain decks. Bringing in Rest in Peace, which I was really surprised to see because I haven't really seen a whole lot of Graveyard Hate being that necessary. But I guess if you're coming up against other decks that are leaning towards that Collect Evidence 6, you might want to be able to hate on the graveyard. And Tear Asunder, giving us that Artifact and Enchantment hate, classic one to include. Also bringing in Kutzil. So Kutzil Malamut Exemplar which your opponent can't cast spells during your turn. So this one, I think, being a good answer to Domain that can kind of struggle sometimes against Azorius control, and so giving you that sideboard option. We've also got the Archangel of Wrath. Was not removed entirely from the deck, just brought to the sideboard, so bring that back in if you're up against mono red, which this deck can struggle a little bit against the pressure against mono red. But like in best of 3, you see mono red less often, generally. And bringing in the Jace, the Perfected Mind, from the sideboard, so you'd bring that one back in the more grindy matches that are going to go to mill. And one copy of Sunfall. This one being like, okay, well, if we're not up against a deck that we want to disrupt with the Deadly Cover-Ups, then we can bring in the Sunfall, where the exile and creature, the token, incubator token generator is better than the Deadly Cover-Up. Or if we just want to run an additional Wrath. And then one copy of Nissa, Ascended Animist. Again, we're going to be bringing this one in against any artifact or enchantment hate, or against decks where we want the overrun effect. They're running the Sunfalls. All right, and the reward for listening to my ramblings for nearly 45 minutes is the new deck that I was talking about, the Boros Tokens deck. So this deck did very well in the tournament in Japan, the Standard Open, and I was talking about it on Sunday as somebody took the list, and very similar list at least, and ran all the way to Mythic with it. And so we see a second place finish over the weekend as well for Boros Tokens. And just a really quick note for those who do play best of 1, it works really well against mono red prowess. It works really well against the mono black discard. It struggles a little bit more with the Celestia Rabbits space. So I think it's relatively well positioned unless Celestia Rabbits becomes like the #1 deck that everyone's playing. It takes a fair amount to craft Celestia Rabbits, so I don't think that it will. But just keep that in mind. So the archetype is basically leaning off of the Caretaker's Talent, which allows us to draw a card every time that a token enters the battlefield. And so we get tokens off of like Carrot Cake, we get tokens off of your Urbrask's Forge, we have the instant speed interaction of Torch the Tower, Lightning Helix, and Get Lost, which makes those are the tools that really help against the mono red prowess builds. We've got the Temporary Lockdown and the Sunfall to kind of help with that weakness of the go wide strategies. We've got the Urbrask's Forge plus this Caretaker's Talent draws you a card every single turn. Not to mention the later parts of the Caretaker's Talent being able to give all of your tokens +2/+2. So this is the key card that's enabling this space, or the strategy, I should say. And Archangel Elspeth creates the tokens, as well as being able to put counters on those tokens to give them lifelink to help you stabilize. Beza giving you life to stabilize against the aggression, and then Virtue of Loyalty giving you the an additional kind of win condition of being able to pump your team, as well as give you that flash 1/2 2/2 for 2 knight token. So really excited to play this deck. I haven't gotten to yet, but it's looking like it's going to win the the community vote from Sunday's video. So I'll probably be playing it next Saturday. And as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we see Destroy Evil. Like I mentioned, pretty good against certain matchups that are running the enchantments, and then can line up well depending on what decks have the 4 toughness. Abrade giving you that artifact hate, Temporary Lockdown helping you if you are up against Boros Convoke or Celestia Rabbits. Serra Paragon can let you play back some of your really broken cards, so if they are able to answer your threats, then Serra Paragon can really be helpful if you're coming up against that one-on-one spot interaction. Lauren of the Third Path destroys artifacts and enchantments. Brotherhood's End gives you another sweeper that can also give you artifact hate. And then an additional copy of Beza if we need that stabilizing force. And then Jaya, Fiery Negotiator, would be if you're up against something that has a lot of wraths, because Planeswalkers don't get hit by wraths, kind of gives you an alternative win condition if they're really good at shutting down your board and sweeping you over and over. Oh, and I misspoke earlier. Okay. So this is the 3rd version of Domain. The previous one was Golgari Midrange that was a repeat, and I had it in my brain as Domain. So this is the final one that I'll talk about. Lots of Domain, I know. but they're all doing something a little bit different. So this one, not too many to talk about. I typically don't talk about an archetype unless there's been 3 cards that have been changed, and this one does have exactly 3, or I mean, no, it has 4. So Archangel of Wrath being brought in here over a Nissa Ascended Animist. Very easy, very straightforward, very similar to the Witch build that we were seeing in Best of 1. So the sideboard, on the other hand, dropped a Get Lost, a Negate, and an Archangel of Wrath to bring in 2 Elspeth Smite. So once again, the kind of weakness this deck struggles with a lot is, so like Domain is really good against Golgari midrange, but struggles against mono red, and then mono red is defeated by Golgari midrange. So that's kind of the original rock, paper, scissors of the best of 3 meta long ago. So Elspeth Smite is, I think, our best answer over the knockout blows, and helps that matchup. And then the Nissa hasn't gone away, it's just been moved to the sideboard. So really easy changes. So with that, I tried to keep it right around 45 minutes. I think I might have gone a little bit long this week, but there's so much to talk about in the blossoming meta of Bloomburrow. So I hope you enjoyed and learned something today. Remember to click like and subscribe. Always love hearing back from you guys, so thank you for all of the comments. And it's been absolutely amazing, all of the wonderful feedback you guys have been giving me, and just general vibes in the community have been really rewarding. So thank you, everybody. And I'll be on tomorrow I'll be back tomorrow for the community deck techs. So we've got some submissions every week. I post a thing on the community tab, and we'll be talking about nerding out about Magic. What I'm trying to emulate is the conversations that you may have once had at a local game store, right? And so I'm just trying to help out, try to give you my ideas. So I think talking about the net decks, if you will, gives you interesting ideas for your own builds, and kind of, I hope I do a decent enough job kind of explaining why the cards are there and the matchups and such, right? You know, I'm doing the best I can. So have a wonderful week, everybody. Enjoy the Bloomburrow meta, and I will catch you all next week for another best of 1, best of 3 meta review, and other stuff throughout the week. So take care.